Detailed purchase agreements must be negotiated with each supplier that goes through all of the details and ideally would contain flowcharts, process maps that help people to visualize who does what and who's responsible for what activity. Vendors must also be able to work with other supply chain players. In my own professional career, I've seen lots of supply chains get in trouble because vendors overseas have a hard time working with designated third-party logistics companies. So the grade for playing well with others in supply chain is very, very important. So our vendors could have a great product at a competitive price, but if for whatever reason they have trouble working with other partners, or they have a bad reputation with origin customs, or the trucking companies don't want to work with them because they never pay them on time, these type of things you have to be cognizant of. How do you do that, or how do you at least start the process? Bullet point number 3. Detailed standard operating procedures in writing and ideally available in the cloud have to be crafted with each supplier. That's where you'd have those process maps and steps and ownership and even the KPIs that we'll be talking about later. The other thing is you can have all the KPIs in the world, all the standard operating procedures, promises until the cows come home. The vendor has to be able to execute from a production perspective, from a logistics perspective, documentation, all of those things. And unfortunately, in the real world, there's only one way to find out if a vendor can do everything they promise, and that's by doing business with them. Ideally, not the cure, not the panacea, but ideally, cloud-based software helps to manage that relationship. Even things like visibility into the status of purchase orders with vendors overseas. There's great software out there, all cloud-based, that allows for just that. Create some management capabilities, some controls for us as the buyer of goods overseas, a sense of confidence in our vendors if they are complying with the terms of the PO. You need that cloud-based software, and it's out there and lots to choose from. Let's talk about strategic sourcing considerations. And we mentioned these in our definition, but this is the high-level stuff. Even at the strategic level of that manufacturing planning and control graphic that we've seen so many times, this is one of those strategic considerations. What countries, what regions are we going to buy from? What's the macroeconomic profile? Are they a so-called advanced nation? Is it an emerging economy? Do they have the infrastructure to support international trade? Access to financing? Is the currency stable? That's what we mean by macroeconomic profile. And within our industry, or the vendor ecosystem within which we are buying, what does that ecosystem look like? How many possible vendors are there in Thailand for the product that we're looking to buy? Myanmar as an emerging market onto the global stage. What does their industry-specific ecosystem look like? How about government stability in today's day and age? Very, very important. How stable is the government? You can go in the news and read about challenges in places from Venezuela to Egypt, some of which is based on government instability. So you need to be thinking about those things. The human rights component, forced labor, slave labor, respect for the environment. You have to evaluate vendors in part based on their track record there. Another one, proximity to other supply chain players. One challenge that China is having or starting to have is that the vendors are moving from the coast, where it's obviously easier to ship goods, especially by ocean freight. They're moving west into the interior of China because of increased labor costs, etc. Well, what does that do to our sourcing strategy as it relates to proximity to other supply chain players? Vendors that move from Shenzhen in Guangdong province in South China, hour or two truck ride from Hong Kong, that up and move to Chengdu in Sichuan province, a couple thousand miles away. What does that do to our strategy? And are they tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers? Proximity to them, proximity to customers, very important, and of course ports, airports, 3PLs, etc. So we need to be thinking about those things. Some more to be thinking about. Utilities infrastructure, water, power, etc. We here in the United States oftentimes overlook this because we take it for granted. Our lights don't go out. We don't have infrastructure issues per se, but in other countries, I've been in plants when the lights go out in different countries. And if that plant doesn't have its own power, its own generator, that's a big problem. So what's the infrastructure? What's its reliability? What's the cost for both water and power? What's the IT infrastructure in a given region, in a country? What's the penetration of internet use? Something, again, we take granted for here in the United States. How about taxes? Demographics of the country. What percentage of the country is at a working age? What's the education level? What's the technical expertise in a country? These are all demographic issues that are tied into education level as well. And then, do we use a single source or a multi-source strategy? Sometimes, depending on our industry, we don't have a choice. We have to use a single or a sole source provider because that's just the way the infrastructure is in that particular industry that we're working in. But we have to know ahead of time what our strategy is going to be in either scenario, single source or multi-source strategy. Some other considerations, and you start to see tie-ins to our earlier topics. Are we going to buy from our own plants overseas as part of a huge multinational intercompany, or are we going to go to third-party sourcing? Completely independent entities from our own organization. That's a strategic consideration that leads us to other decisions around sourcing and actual procurement activities. Vendor profiles and qualifications. What does a vendor need for us to even consider working with them? Some other considerations, labor costs. We talked about what's going on in China now, where coastal China is becoming too expensive and production is moving west, inland, or leaving China entirely and going to places like Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam. What are the labor costs, or what are the differences between sourcing in those countries? Of course, unit costs for our goods, and one of our cornerstones, landed cost, because as we now know, there's a big difference between unit cost and landed cost. And if we indeed change sourcing from China to Myanmar because the labor costs and ultimately our unit cost is less, what does that do, for example, to customs duties on products coming out of China versus the same product coming out of Myanmar? Doesn't necessarily mean that the customs duty is going to be the same coming into the U.S., even though it's the same product. In fact, it's very likely in the United States that the same product coming out of China versus Myanmar will indeed be different from a customs duty perspective. That will impact our landed cost. Altogether, too many companies make those changes, don't think about that, and then are asking themselves at the end of the quarter why their gross profit and cost of goods sold are so high and their gross profit is down 3%. These are the things we need to think of ahead of time. Logistics infrastructure. What do the ports look like? What are the roads? Another thing we take for granted here in the United States is that our highways are paved. Our roads are paved mostly. It's not like that in other places. These are the questions that you need to ask, and oftentimes go and see for yourself. What do the airports look like? How long is a runway in the main airport? Can it take a 777 aircraft, a 747 freighter, an Antonov? These types of considerations. What's the risk profile in that country? Is it more likely from a risk perspective that my goods might get stolen in Mexico versus Brazil? I don't know, but you have to look into these things. That's a supply chain, or a part of a supply chain risk profile. Does a country have free trade agreements with the United States, as we also discussed in Module 1, and it's coming to life in subsequent modules? Free trade agreements mean just that. Close to zero or zero duty rates, which impact our landed costs. In the age of free trade agreements, with the upcoming Trans-Pacific Partnership going to be signed and hopefully ratified sometime in the next couple of years, those are things we need to be thinking about. How about those preferential duty programs that we talked about? The generalized system of preferences, back again, staring us in the face in a procurement type of scenario. We need to know these things. Country-specific, product-specific, harmonized system number specific. What are the customs regs? What are the lead times? All the things that we've talked about. Now, in a very specific sourcing, strategic sourcing environment.